This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. Hello and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I am your host, Jabari Evans, Assistant Professor of Race and Media at USC Columbia, as well as current visiting scholar at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. For those of you who are new to this podcast, I'm grateful to have you join me as I talk with scholars, journalists, as well as media makers about their work as it concerns issues of race and journalism, new media, and mass communication. Today's guest is Evan F. Moore, who is a Chicago-based journalist, syndicated columnist, educator, as well as a content writer. Evan grew up on Chicago's South Side, just like me, in the South Shore neighborhood. He graduated from Morgan Park High School. From there, he attended Hampton University. And after discovering his love for journalism, he attended Roosevelt University's journalism program in Chicago and turned for several Chicago media outlets. And his work has been featured in Rolling Stone, ESPN's The Undefeated, The Shadow League, The Grade, DNA Info, Bleacher Report, Chicagoist, The Nation, Chicago Magazine, Ebony, Crane's Chicago Business, and the Chicago Tribune, amongst others. Welcome to the pod, Evan. You know, we've been trying to make this happen for a minute. I'm glad to see you are well, and I'm happy to
Yeah,
work with
yeah, that bio that was a minute ago, but yeah, I'll shoot you the information. But it's
you.
mostly right. It's okay.
For
Yeah,
sure.
it's mostly right, so it's all good. But
You know, it's funny when it comes to like bios, particularly when I end up doing um like talks or like panels. Sometimes I don't even recognize who they're describing or like where they got certain information from. But at the same time, though, a lot of it is like accurate, but it's like pulled
Mhm.
from different sources that may or may not be current. But yeah, I'd just went to the quick little Googles.
Yeah, I think my website is the first one that comes up, and I think like the DePaul bio was
Yeah,
probably the most accurate is on there too. But I don't fault people. I got to change my website thing, so I don't really fault people for going to like the first thing that comes up, which is that. So.
that's real. That's real. Well, I mean, to that point, right? Like, um, I guess this is like a segue in and of itself. Like I've talked to a lot of students here, in the journalism school here at University of South Carolina about like how they brand themselves or how they go about kind of presenting themselves on social media, and how that can be more than ever like almost like a virtual resume or a calling card, so to speak, like having a following. Um, how has that sort of impacted your career journey and your pathway as a storyteller, or just even in terms of how you choose the stories that you want to write about, or how you go about, reaching out to sources or any of that stuff? How has social media sort of changed the way you do journalism?
Well, I mean, social media was still it was infancy when I first started. I mean, so
Hmm.
I've always like so long as I've been in journalism, there's always been social media. I
Right.
mean, you have some older folks who talk about the good old days and everything else, but it's a place where you find people and you
Hmm.
can kind of craft a brand or curate a brand or whatever. And like just know or just I just throughout the career I always thought about, how I'm gonna present myself, who's online, where are they looking at, where they're seeing. And
Hmm.
some of my I guess some of my most memorable moments or stories were things that were crafted online, like that people got to know me. Like I will say they go back in the way back machine of like when I first like I wouldn't say it was viral, but it was like like when people was like, who is this guy? Type of thing was
Yeah.
You might remember back when the whole thing popped off with Jackie Robinson West, and the
Hmm.
reporter who broke that story
Hmm.
was denied entry into a press conference where it was several JRW people and everything else.
Hmm.
And I was there too on behalf of the Red Eye. I was going to write a column about the press conference and what was going on. And at the time, it was this really weird press conference where they like weren't taking questions,
Mm.
and it was just like, why invite media if they can't answer questions, right?
Right.
And yeah, so I was just online complaining about it, like this is bullshit. This is how you gonna do this? We're only here because somewhere somebody around the line that messed up and made this a story. So it's like you brought us here basically by the uh the lack of action by the parents and
Hmm.
having the kids out there. So just like, what's going on here? And it was just basically me just kind of railing on like this story and how it came out and knowing how people felt about it and everything else. And then, like when things were really good, when they was winning Chicago in a year and everyone was, like when you start seeing bootleg JRW t-shirts everywhere and like it's like now I was able to talk. You was able to get these folks on the phone, but now something happens, nobody wants to talk. And it's kind of like that's not how it works.
Mm.
Like that's why I always will tell sources like, look, I'm gonna write about you when you do something good, but also I'm gonna write about you do something bad. I don't have any bad intentions, but you put something out there in the sphere, in the public sphere, you can't expect me like not to talk about it.
Right. Right. I mean, I think to your point, like, I think that's what we were getting at when we had our own podcast, and we had brought me, you, and a couple other guys together to try to, like, talk about things going on in Chicago. And I think part of the impetus for that was that, I think having different perspectives, but also seeing, discourse that was happening in different corners of social media, and like how that then you could be in real time talking about something as you are somewhere, and like the connectivity, particularly in a place like Chicago, where I think as much as we like to say our neighborhoods are kind of siloed off, um everybody kind of knows someone that knows someone. So, I think it goes into that whole, like, who is this dude? Like, what school did he go to? Like, how does he know? Who is he? Let's learn something about who this person is professionally. And sometimes I think when I talk to students, it's almost like they're almost scared to push their subjectivity to the front sometimes, or sometimes scared to utilize kind of their instinct, so to speak, and the ways in which they, maybe they are one way online, and they have presented themselves a whole different way online as a journalist, and they try to separate those. But I think in this environment, it's really hard to do that. And so, I commend you in telling the stories that you've tended to tell, but then also approaching it in a way where I don't see the difference between who you are online and who you are in your writing. And often I don't like I think some people struggle with how to maintain who they are and have that through line show up no matter what, whether they're being objective or whether they're giving their opinion. There's still a level of quality, but then it's also consistency within the messaging. And I think you do that pretty well. Um, when did you first consider yourself like a real writer?
I would say, I mean, I didn't
If
take
that's
the
a
route that
thing, if
most
that's a
journalists
thing,
take.
I imagine it's a thing.
I didn't take the route that most journalists take. It wasn't like I wanted to grow up to be one and everything else like that. It was just like I guess for me, because I started blogging. That's kind of how I
Mm,
like with my entryway into writing and everything else. But then I parlayed that into writing articles for one of the local community now defunct community journalism newspapers and knowing, I guess at the time when I had written a blog and they wanted to republish it in their newspapers. I was like, yeah, cool. But let me know when
mm,
it comes out. So they told me it was out. So I remember working work or whatever, and it was pretty early in the morning. I just stopped by a newsstand and saw, the when I got out the car, saw the stand, opened the stand or whatever. So I grabbed the paper, flipped through it, and I saw buy Evan F. Moore. And that was kind of like that moment where I kind of was like, I guess I felt like I found my calling, like my way to contribute to the world. And for some people, it happens right away as they're a
Yeah.
kid. And sometimes it happens in their early 30s, like it happened to me. Like at one point, I was either going to be either going to law enforcement, fireman or teaching.
Hmm.
And because, I grew up in a household with two, well, both my parents were CPS educators. So I was
Mm.
always around like education and books
Hmm.
and having family members that were, members of the Nation of Islam and Black Panther Party and just like business owners and things like that. And just watching them over time, like this get together through a family function, just talk about, being Black in Chicago and Black in the world, like this, the ideas and the news of the day, this, hearing like different viewpoints. And that's kind of was like, okay, well, even then I knew like I was getting some sort of like, you sit there as a kid and be like, oh wow, all right, so they feel this way about this thing. And looking back in like different moments that happened, in Chicago as a kid and upbringing and seeing how different things move people. Like I remember like when the Bears won the Super Bowl, that happened when I was in first grade. Some people don't remember I just remember it's weird because I don't remember actually watching the actual game Super Bowl 20, but I remember like how excited people were leading up to it. Like anywhere you went, like people were talking about the Bears, right? And
Yeah.
even something as somber as, getting the news when Harold Washington died, like this,
Yeah.
even going to the funeral, like this, how like sad Black people were. I still
Oh
remember that,
man.
like as a kid, like, and obviously, like things would happen, like when the homie the clown thing was happening on the South Side, and also like the Bulls winning championships, like this was happening when you wore a starter jacket, like all these different like cultural flashpoints. You just kind of remember as a kid growing up, and how you were kind of exposed to so much, like this. It was all there that someone I felt like needed to tell that story and write about.
I try to tell people all the time that like clearly there's a bias there when I talk about Chicago, but like I think the vector and time or like the era of maybe you and I's childhood in Chicago, like where we were able to see certain milestones happen at certain ages. um I think that perspective of even the sports events that happen, the just having seen the Michael Jordan era happen or seeing
Mm-hmm.
Oprah Winfrey sort of build an empire in Chicago at that
Mm-hmm.
time, or having Obama happen, at that time, or even seeing
Mm-hmm.
like his ascendance, not even him being a senator, but him like trying to enter into that space. These were all conversations. Harold Washington, for sure, was one of those moments that I remember crying as a little kid and like just feeling like the rug was pulled out from under us because everybody seemed so happy in the city. But like there's so many different things that I think occurred from maybe the late 80s to 2000 that like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if a kid growing up in Chicago after that would have the same perspective. But what I do realize though is like when I read your work, because I read it pretty often, whether it's somebody shares it with me or whether I see it on Twitter or if I see it on Facebook, or even if you share something, oftentimes people don't even have to tell me it's your byline for me to kind of know. I'm like, that sounds like something Evan would do. You know what I mean? And I think for me, I've like if I had to sum it up, like because I was talking to one of my colleagues about, I was like, I feel like you've mastered sort of a storytelling that not only humanizes, neighborhoods on the South side that typically maybe don't get those softer stories, But you also find a way similar to like Dilla does on Instagram, like you kind of tell cultural history about these neighborhoods that maybe have been ignored previously by major outlets. Do you see that as like your duty, or is that just something that aligns with who you are and you're just like, I like this, I want to tell this story, and that's just what it is? But do you think about it in that way, or do you just think of it like I'm just interested in
The latter was, I mean, I think of like when I started blogging, I just really just blogged about the things I was interested in, and also that kind of morphed into what other people were saying, like
mm,
like sports, politics, pop culture, music, fashion, like to being in the hood, like all the things I was interested in. But in terms of that question of larger sense, like it really did start with like it really went from me talking about the stuff I thought that was important to it becoming a duty.
mm,
And I mean, for Black journalists, it's different. I mean, we're in the aftermath of seeing what really that is, and
uh,
yeah, I mean, there's times when I wanted to tell a story a certain way, and an editor was like, nah, I don't know, like,
mm,
but this I felt like, growing up where I grew up, I was around a lot of different people. You had people that did pretty well for themselves, like, like
yeah,
houses in the Highlands started at
mhm,
500K.
mhm,
But they're a block, then like a block away, you see
mhm.
poverty
Yep.
and gangs and everything that's, that you will see. Like I always tell people, like, man, like South Shore, one of the diverse neighborhoods in the city, not in terms of when people think diverse, they think race. But I
Yeah,
always tell people like economics and also what people are into. Like,
that's true.
one of my childhood friends is Bum J.
Mhm,
And like, like he had his path and everything else, but I was on another path.
mhm,
But you also have all these different folks that's all like just doing all these different things like this, like yourself and others who are doing who are in the same neighborhood who may or may not have like, who may have shared the same space, but
mhm.
they're wherever they were doing their lives took them to where they are.
Yeah,
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 because I definitely felt like it was. I mean, I started, I guess when I knew it was a duty
mhm,
was I was waiting for the bus. I was leaving class at the time. I was at Roosevelt getting my degree. And I was leaving class. I was sitting there like waiting for this bus like everyone else.
mhm.
And this older Black man walked up to me and he's like, "Are you Evan Moore?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "I read your columns in the Red Eye. Would like to shake your hand." So I was like, "Okay, cool." Shook his hand. We talked for a bit. He went on with the day, went on with mine. So that kind of told you right there, like this, you think you're in your bubble talking about the things you feel like are important, but someone is really like looking to you to like, they're like, oh, he's one of us. He's
Yeah,
gonna talk about it in a way that I'm gonna understand it hourly, but someone who know he may have to break it down for him. But yeah, so it's definitely from there on I did kind of feel like a duty, and it was a duty in a good way.
mhm.
But I was there at times where you just kind of like, like I'm just trying to do my thing. I'm not trying to be like some fucking leader or something. Like, but it kind of turns out that for some people you are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, from a business standpoint, I mean, we talk quite a bit in my classes about industry more so than the actual craft of journalism. But one of the things that I realize about print in particular is that, there's been a need to sort of rearrange their thinking on how to make money. And even in reconsidering, like, well, we had this typical audience that would be the people who, got the paper to their front door every morning. My parents got that, but like I remember, there were other neighborhoods that's more frequent, right? And so, uh, in today's environment, where Black folk maybe wouldn't get subscriptions, but they're online and are power users of online networking and social media platforms and so on and so forth, and drive trends, and um I guess drive the algorithm in certain ways, and in many instances are more trusting to put their energy, their faith, and sometimes their money into the digital space. You think from a business standpoint that things have changed in terms of how even editors view black stories about not just black like celebrities or black athletes, but just even some of the stories you've been doing about black neighborhoods and people wanting to see and hear themselves in the stories that they read about and wanting that diversity to really be reflected. Have you noticed there a change in terms of how those higher ups think about that, or have you noticed there be a kind of a change where folks are kind of like almost encouraging you to go in that direction?
Well, it depends on the outlet.
Hmm.
I mean, I remember for a long time, like the Chicago Tribune was viewed as the suburban conservative paper, and then the
Yeah.
Sun Times was like the city paper, quote
Right.
unquote, working class city paper.
Right.
And it kind of depends on the outlet, as I said, but it's like
Hmm.
I do feel people are more vocal about because of social media, more vocal about what they're seeing and how they see themselves and how they view the news. I mean, I remember it was a study, I've cited it in a couple of classes I've taught from City Bureau and University of Texas about media coverage and how people see themselves and most of the black people they spoke with like felt like that news about them was negative,
Yeah.
and which is completely accurate, but it's like you just kind of have to think about like why folks see themselves that like feel like that media isn't fair to them,
Hmm.
and that can play into self-esteem, how you see yourself, how you see your neighborhood,
Yeah.
and if you're sitting there telling your sit and media is like outwardly or covertly or overtly telling you that your neighborhood sucks. I mean, it's like someone obviously thinks about Inglewood, like they people go to a place that's negative
Yeah.
because they're bombarded with all these different things, and sometimes you don't see. I mean, I was I'm always one of those people where it's like I'm a big media literacy guy, and like it's
Hmm.
been times where I've seen someone be like, "I bet the media doesn't show this or see that," and you like Google it and you see like a bunch of articles about it, and it's like you're not reading, like you're not.
Mm.
I mean, I know I speak from a place of privilege because I grew up around newspapers, books,
Yep.
information.
Yep.
Like so it's like even like most of the social media stuff I follow, like it's a lot of different reporters and other things, but it's like, it's like sometimes I think that we think journalists kind of think that people should know certain things already, but they don't
Right.
realize that like folks on the other side of it, they look at it as like y'all keeping some big secret, you
Mm.
know, and like some journalists over time have done a better outlets have done a better job of explaining. I mean, with me, I came in like in a time where it was just like I really was like, how do I break it down? Like if I'm talking to some friends outside or in a barber shop or at a bar or something, like how do I
Hmm.
the story like breaking it down to somebody? Like when I write, I don't like really look at myself as the writer. I look at myself as what's the reader's point of view. What are they going to get out of this? What are they going to learn?
Mm.
Like what's going to be their takeaway,
Mm.
right? So it's what something I'm always thinking. I've always like try to pepper stories with history
Hmm.
and getting people to think about things that they may have not thought before, but also say like, hey, like there's precedent for this. Why I'm feeling strongly about this particular point. I
Yeah.
mean, it may not even be a column where someone's asked basically, I'm just riffing on what I think about something. It could be just straight up news and me coming with facts. But behind
Yeah.
that, it was intentional to me to write about that topic and intentional who I interview, intentional of, it's like I said earlier about precedent. So there's plenty of that. And
Hmm.
I know you earlier talking about like, you know, objectivity and everything. And that's kind of the thing that's bullshit because like
Mm,
when I've pitched stories over time, I'm intentional about, hey, this is something I think is important.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting because like it's a fine line because I think there's something to be said for like you can tell a story objectively, but it's just the fact that people aren't willing to chase a certain story for whatever reason. And like specifically, if we're thinking like Black Chicago, oftentimes the stories are limited to the statistics or this happened over the weekend or that's going on there. And it's really related to just, okay, this is the amount of crime that occurred, something happened. But like, you can objectively tell the human story, like if you're just literally, willing to ask the sources, willing to go into the neighborhoods, and it, maybe you don't have access if you're not someone who doesn't have that level of rapport or like familiarity, but like I think that's the thing that I've had a hard time trying to talk to students about here, just because I've had to learn sort of the dynamics of where they come from, because I know what it looks like in Chicago, but I don't necessarily know what it looks like in Charleston. I don't necessarily know what it looks like in Aiken. I don't necessarily know what it looks like in Wilmington, North Carolina. I don't necessarily know what it even looks like in Charlotte or Atlanta. But I know in Chicago that dynamic is there. It's just sometimes you need those people who are versatile enough to have sources there. And there needs to be more pathways for people who are able to tell the stories to have jobs. And so, but I think that's also where this era has allowed for like, what we call citizen journalism, where it's like, oh, I'm not affiliated with nobody. I just choose to write this story because I want to write it, Um,
Right.
and I think that's almost like an extension of the blog era. Uh, in terms of kind of stories you've written recently, I know you wrote something on the house music scene here. And it's funny because you were talking about like how people are like, that story never gets told. I would go talk to people, outside of Chicago, and they're just like, what's going on the South Side? Like, what's going on? I heard this many shootings and this whoop whoop and this and that. And I'm like, well, what's going on is 60,000 people just gathered and no one was hurt. And it was a fun time. And we listened to house music and we danced and like I saw a lot of prowlers and motorcycles in the street like
Yeah,
and
those
fireworks.
slingshots too. Yeah, those slingshots
But
too. Yeah.
and I saw like, my like fifth grade teacher juking. And I saw like my homegirl from eighth grade, but it was a perfect weekend and nothing happened. And they don't often tell that story. And you wrote a story not necessarily about the house picnic, but about just house's origins in Chicago. Um, I guess for those who haven't read the story, I guess could you give sort of a synopsis of sort of, kind of that story that you told, but then also why it was important to you to want to write that article.
Yeah, because I guess I mean I'm not a house head by any
Hmm.
shape or form. And writer who wrote it with me, Michael Liptrot, he's a 20 something guy who's from Alabama, and neither of us are house heads or anything like that.
Right.
So they kind of brought me in to help him out, not help
Hmm.
him out, but like like they probably like some experience and everything like that. So I was kind of thinking of it in the sense of obviously growing up here in the city, being a hip hop head and being, what we called a backpacker. So all the part of the
All
scene I was
right.
adjacent to the house, right? And
Mhm.
so you had obviously you would go to house events and stuff like that, and you kind of obviously felt like there was like a schism between hip hop and house and
Oh yeah.
yeah, everything else. And what you're into really dominated like your social circle because
Yeah.
like friendships will get severed if one friend moved toward another scene. Like friends will be and bump. Like our friend group, they was kind of more into like house and going to the rink on 87th
Hmm.
and stuff like that. And I really wasn't. I was trying to like I was into like, getting up and
Hmm.
fat laces and look back and the boom bap stuff. So it
Yeah,
wasn't like, somebody some beef popped off and we stopped fucking with each other or not became friends. It was just like we were on totally different divergent
yeah,
paths, So it kind of happens where it's like people like literally like your social circle based off the music or the culture,
yeah.
like was Slum's dad. But yeah, there's like my view of house music. I did have like that view of like, oh, like, and I mentioned the story about disco demolition night and what happened all with that. And that's kind of where you think about where it's like one group who felt like, oh, I don't like disco, blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah, whatever. Let's blow up these records. And then you had another group like, hey, I like disco. And
Yeah.
there's black kids, there's Latino kids, there's gay people, there's straight people. Everybody's getting along. It's cool.
Hmm.
So they viewed it in a certain way. And, especially when you found out like those people weren't even bringing most of the record they were bringing weren't disco record. They were like
Yeah.
Otis Clay and like
R&B.
and Curtis Mayfield who
Yeah.
aren't disco.
Mm.
So and you're telling yourself you just grabbed any black artist you saw and was through it like so even like that like house is weird because like a lot of house music history is like word of mouth, and that's why we talked to so many people for that article, even people who didn't necessarily make it in the article to be quoted, but we still talking because everybody had an opinion. And even that University of Chicago event I went to, like, it's funny because like the guy Braxton Holmes, I had known him for a while because I had known his brother Lawrence, who's on 6 a.m. to Score, and I had been on, his show a bunch of times, and
Hmm.
I knew he was a house head and was a producer. And I brought the story with him, like, hey, like this is what I was trying to do and everything else. And I was like, how did house start? He's like, I can't really answer your question. And he was like, come to this event with me. Out of nowhere, he texted me like, come to this event. I'm like, all right, so I go, and I see like as I described it in the story, like
Yeah.
these two guys were going back and forth. I'm like, I kind of knew what to make of it, but I was just like, wow, like really, I thought hip hop was bad with like infighting and problems and credit, but when you see this, you're like, yo, like, but also at the same time, and it's like go back to what I was saying earlier, how some people will be in the same space
Mm.
and just kind of remember things differently. Like it was
Yeah.
like I remember that from some of the hip hop stories I've written, also the Sci-Fi Weekly about parties in the '90s, and the one
Yeah.
I did for the Sun Times that kind of like people kind of know me for about going to those like hip hop spaces on the South Side, and like
Yeah.
the reaction to it was really great because I remember one story I did and I posted the ill nature photo from the Blackstone party we did, and someone swore some two, three people jumped my mention and swore up and down and thought that was like what event was that? It was some award show that was here in the '90s in Chicago, and I
Mm.
kept telling them like, nah, that's the
That's
Blackstone
it.
Hotel, the party we threw. That's a photo from it,
Yeah.
and bunch of me and my guys were there. That was literally our party, so we know.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what the thing was with the house story. It was like you have all these different people who literally were in the same spaces, but they remember things different. They have their experience, and you can't tell them they're wrong. But it's like people remember things differently, and with that, and like who's the Godfather of the house, who's
Yeah.
the who was the first song creator of the house, and through this story and the reporting, I learned that that there was a culture before house like had an official name.
Right.
And so just learning how it all came about and like how in society we're kind of quick to label people because one of the person I spoke with, like he was in the house. And sometimes we're like when someone like you say you're a house head, they automatically think you're gay.
Right.
It wasn't. And it was like I like the music. That's it. Like this.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the things that I feel like house has that hip hop has to really figure it out. Like, to think about it. Like like there's been gay rappers, but not anyone,
Mm-mm.
something that, you got dudes in the hood like, yeah, it's my
Yeah,
shit. Like,
no,
that was
not
we that's
coexisting
still
that
we
way.
that's, we still in the wilderness about that, and with the whole thing with the misogyny thing, and that's the thing that hip hop in some areas has yet to really like fully like reckon with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
so
that's for
but
certain.
yeah, and you definitely see where those issues aren't a thing in house culture. But also you have the thing where it's like it gets like on a bigger level, it gets labeled as like just like quote unquote dance music and EDM, and
Mhm.
that's like that's big time erasure right there, and like like you can definitely question someone and they tell you about Daft Punk and everything else, but can't name like Little Lewis or Frankie Knuckles or
Yeah,
anyone like that. So it's like it will definitely. I mean, I'm not saying I precious was saying I'm not a house head, but over time, it'll definitely like even before I wrote the story, it'll definitely like I had a growing appreciation of house and what
mm,
especially the history in our neighborhood of it, and like and those mixers back in the day at various Catholic schools,
that's
like
true.
we both were at De La Salle at different points, so we
Yeah.
remember those high school parties and everything else, and that's something you don't really see today, but
Mm-mm.
just learning like this these folks had a community and they're very passionate about it. Just like, we're how hip hop is taking us in directions we've gone into, where you're teaching at university, I'm teaching at university, and I'm writing other different stuff and always harken back to the music and the times I had and the friends and everything else in that community. So
Man,
it's like I definitely understood, when they talk about community, I'm like, it's people over the time, like even the fact that I know you, like I was a fan of you as a rapper before I knew you as a person, like knew you.
yeah,
And then once I found out you was from the same neighborhood as me, I was like all about it. And your music was like something that I can personally identify with. Yeah, I listen to hood shit and everything else, but it was like nobody was talking
like
about being like a middle
this
class black
character.
kid who had to like figure himself out in all these different spaces. And like that's I think like you and Common and folks like that, when that music was speaking to me on that level.
Yeah.
So I definitely understood like when these folks were saying like they talk about community and how the music like makes them feel. And I was think
Mhm.
about being in school, college in Virginia and going to school with a lot of DC kids, and they're thinking go out there and
Go
then
go.
to be in
Yeah.
that environment and see how they interact with the music and juxtaposing it with house. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, a
Okay.
similar thing. Yeah, no, I would
Mhm.
never claim to be a house head. I think what I noticed over even when I was younger, but even more so now is like it's a winning room. Kind of sometimes you do as the Romans do. And then I came to have an appreciation for the way it makes the people in the room feel, where like there's a vibe that's happening in those functions that I think is so cool. Or even the idea that like almost similar to like my West Indian friends when they talk about carnival, like their grandmother can be out there in a bikini and like shaking and no one thinks anything of it. I think house kind of has a similar scene where like you'll see somebody that's 60 years old dancing their face off, but then you'll see someone that's younger doing the same thing, and everybody just has caught a vibe, whether it's a University of Chicago student who's just being introduced to house, or whether it's somebody who's been coming to the picnic since it was actually a real picnic with lawn chairs. Uh,
Mhm.
and to see that and the power of that, I made friends with like Terry Hunter and folks like that when I was like, doing music really heavily. And even the fact that they were in different genres, it never really made a big difference to me. It was more like their understanding of music was so vast. And and then being DJs know music, all of this stuff is sampling, all of this stuff is soul, funk, it's all black music.
Mhm.
But as this stuff gets gentrified, or if someone like Beyonce or Drake decides to do an album that's called House, I can see why now You got folks arguing over it. I've been writing a lot about drill lately, and I've seen something similar where like now Brooklyn and London and those scenes. If I were to ask somebody about drill, they're thinking about that and not even realize. I mean, me being where I'm from, I'm so like, no, it was it was these, and
Right.
it
There was
not even
definitely a lot of
Keith,
that.
it's
Yeah, definitely a
Louis,
lot of that in
it's
the house. Like,
Pac-Man, but now I can see that happening maybe
mhm.
10 years from now where folks are going to be like, wow, drill, we didn't get the credit we deserve. Most of those guys really didn't blow up. It was a few of them did, but the ones who were really considered drill, I don't know if they necessarily, a lot of those guys didn't get the credit they deserve. And on a national level, for sure, uh,
Mhm.
I think though those who I talk to, like if I just talk to a random person about culture, they associate drill with London more than anywhere. And then they think that New York took it from London when I try to have to remind them like Chicago, there's no drill without Chicago,
Mhm.
But
And you even talk to
similarly,
most of those guys, they shout out Steve Keith as like their influences.
and
And it definitely goes back to something Little Lewis said in the talk. He was like, yeah, and it's a weird dichotomy with black artists where it's like, like white artists will cite you and say like, oh, you influenced me, but then before you know it, you opening up for them, but you the originator. So
yeah,
it's like
yep.
that's definitely why I think that it's funny because like Michael, the person I wrote the drill story, not drill, I'm sorry, the house music story with, on the same night, we both went to two different events talking about, the 40th anniversary of house.
Hmm.
And in both events, like a spirited debate broke out.
Wow.
Yeah, so that kind of shows you right there that folks are really passionate about not only the music, but also like, getting their credit,
Yeah.
which I understand, as a creative fellow creative. And because in our field with journalism, aren't these stories like when someone like breaks a story and then sees another outlet like write it up and they don't credit you, and you
Mm,
just like, I'm the one who did all the work here.
yeah.
Like you just swooping in, like saying, "Cause maybe you have a bigger platform or something." You just swooping in, so that's one of those things where it's like a big thing in the journalism. That's like a big like faux power, and it's like that's kind of rampant.
Mm,
And especially if you're writing about music and
mhm,
a blog comes on and says, "Hey, check this out," and you're like, "I wrote that first. Like I literally was the
mm,
person that's credit me." It's simple, like credit me, like that simple. But to some people, they like
right.
to spend it literally take the same amount of time.
Site
I don't
sources.
mind saying first reported wherever instead of acting like you was originator when you wasn't. So
That's
I
real.
definitely understand that.
I mean, I guess veering off because I know we're almost at time, but like, do you think that 'cause I've had a lot of conversations lately about this, but I wasn't, I think the work that I do, the research I kind of have inserted myself into is less oriented towards, again, the craft of journalism and more oriented towards like, all right, well, how does culture kind of intersect with mass communication more broadly? And then also like, well, how does this industry work? And how does this industry impact race, gender, and class, or vice versa? And I'm wondering, like, as much as folks want to be podcasters, bloggers, influencers, if there isn't millions of dollars put into certain institutions to do the research or to do the archiving or to do the like the real boots to ground like work in a real thorough and rigorous way, we can't have reaction videos and like we can't have like is there a fear? Because I know I've sat on panels where there's a fear that like major journalistic institutions are going to lose the funding out from under them, and then the whole thing will be the wild wild west. And I'm wondering, how you see this, seeing that like you've seen different phases of how this industry has worked. Is there still sort of this panic, or have things sort of evolved where digital content is now profitable enough where there's an understanding that the money is still going to be there to resource all of the work that gets done by journalists like you?
I mean, yeah, it's a panic because you've seen commercials about AI. I remember
Mm.
like this transcribing service I use for interviews, and now like they starting to like trying to formulate thoughts for you, and it's like, oh, I do
Wow.
that now. I'm good at that. And it's
Wow.
like, but I think I saw an AI commercial the other day where like someone was writing a letter and AI did it for them, and it's like, hmm. Even in like even in my spaces, because this the spring quarter I taught a class, and like I had a student who turned in a paper,
Mhm.
and it's completely different from the other paper they turned in the course of the quarter, right? So I'm like, all right, let me put this through an AI generator. I put it through three AI generators. 61% AI generated,
Oh wow.
60%. Now I'm just like, I don't think the student
Confront
was
that.
trying to like cheat or get one over on me, but it was still kind of like,
Mm.
yeah, you gotta formulate thoughts here. Like you gotta have an opinion, like on your
Mm.
own. Like, nah. But answer your question, yeah, definitely that's fair. Yeah, that you have just think about the recent controversies over drink champs in the Kanye interview and also Club Shay Shay. And you have folks like, and the journalism being like, that's not journalism. You're not asking questions, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. And it's
Right.
like, these people aren't journalists. Why are you expecting journalism from people who will tell you they're not journalists? Even in one case, Nori said he was in one case, but if you look at their show now, like they sent them, they put that disclaimer there.
Yeah.
So it's like I don't know if everybody like really peeped that like in that way it did, but it's like they had that disclaimer there, like telling you like, hey, we're just like whatever.
Mhm.
So,
We want
like,
you to
but
acknowledge
this
that
is
we're
where
friends with some
people
of these
it's
people.
weird because they can like put something out there, and if it's wrong, they could be like, whoops. But if I do it, it's like, oh my God,
Uh,
like 'cause people are
yeah.
expecting a certain standard, but it's like, unfortunately, that's where a lot of folks are getting their news. They're getting their news from Instagram and Twitter and sound bites
Yeah.
and things like that. So it's like, but also you have industry people who feel more comfortable going to a drink champs and these
Mm.
other ones and Club Shay Shay and the shop and all these like platforms where they're not going to be, pressed on these things. But also my brief stint on the entertainment desk at the Sun Times, like it happened more than once where I was interviewing an artist and then they said, hey, can I see the article before it comes out? I'm like,
Mhm.
no.
Mhm.
Like, this is why is I literally sat down and told them what I was going to do.
Mhm.
And like the article will reflect the questions I asked and what you told me.
Once we on the
But
record, we on
somewhere along the
the
line, someone told them that shit was cool. And it's not. And it's like, wow.
record. Well, yeah, no, it's an interesting thing that like I think I've seen that, to your point, these middle ground, uh even with sports journalism or sports media, where now athletes are telling the stories themselves through podcasting or through their own outlets or their own social media platforms, and that's sort of circumventing in some ways uh the new media, as someone like Draymond Green would call it. It's just kind of like, to me, a farce. Like, I think that there's there's still like this understanding that there has to be infrastructure to sort of both sides exist and both sides help one another, and without like the resources behind kind of
Right.
the
Like,
old way of things going. Because even with Chat GPT, I was told by one of my friends that like a majority of that is taken from sources like the New York Times and the Washington Post in terms of how they write things, or if you ask it or prompt it to do something professionally or in a journalistic way, they're basically mining through the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the New York Times. So if that
mhm,
work wasn't done, if all of the money that was poured into those institutions during those periods of time to cover news in a certain way, if those things die, I guess I just wonder less necessarily about like the discipline of journalism, but more about like the quality of information that we get, or as you
yeah.
say, like the ability to think for ourselves.
I think like even played out with that thing that happened with the Pat McAfee show, where is when the Bears defensive coordinator was ousted,
Mm,
and I think McAfee had said that the FBI raided Hallis Hall, and but then you have ESPN where he's at, but you also have their reporters who didn't report that because from their source of the knowledge that probably didn't happen.
right.
But you have McAfee saying it did. So
Wow.
it's like, as a consumer, what does that tell you? Like, who's who? Well,
Yeah.
who's like, that's kind of where it's at. Like, even when I mentioned earlier about Club Shay Shay and other shows, like this is where folks are kind of consuming, their media, and they
Mm,
don't know what's real, what's fake, or whatever, or somebody's embellishing
yeah.
or whatever. So it's like, what do we do?
Well, I pray for my son's generation. He just turned 17 last week. So that's kind of the conversation that I've
Mm,
had with him, because he gets a lot of information from TikTok, and he gets a lot of information
mm,
from Discord, and gets a lot of information from these other um sites or whatever. And I try to, again, to your point about media literacy, I try to like, I'm like, you can't have me as your dad teaching and researching this stuff, and you are still like using this in a way where you're not being media literate. Or like, I can still remember him coming to me about Ben Shapiro saying something, and him telling me that like because it had a lot of views, he thought that it was correct. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that. Like, I was like, oh, this is their generation, like, and uh,
mm-hmm.
and
Likes and follows, all that.
it makes me wonder, how things are going to move in the future, because there definitely is this want to kind of associate clout with honesty, or associate clout with
Mm-hmm.
quality of messaging. And it's like, nah, it doesn't always work in that way. Sometimes it's the person that you don't see, that has no followers, that has the best information. And like, and so what do we lose if these institutions go away? That's something that I, have been wrestling with a couple of colleagues, in terms of like some of the things that they're researching, and just my thoughts and opinions. But I really appreciate you taking the time to chop it up with me, man. This has been like, I know this is one of those conversations that I feel like if it was done over a beer with a cigar, it could have lasted even longer.
Oh yeah.
But I really appreciate you, man, sharing some of your experiences, sharing your journey. Um, even the stuff that I already knew, it always it never ceases that I hear more, you know, information in the bars, so to speak. And so I just wanted to give you your flowers on that end, man, because I see I've always admired you as a writer, and I think what you do, um, is something that is necessary. And as you keep doing it, I feel like you keep getting better. And so I appreciate you, man, and thank you for giving me your time. And shoot, if you got anything you want to plug, I know you wrote a book recently. If you want to shout that out before we get out of here, that's cool
Oh
too.
yeah, we can do that. Yeah, second edition, game misconduct, hockey taught and culture, how to fix it. You may not be a hockey fan, but we see a lot of in terms of gatekeeping and all these different things. We see it in academia, law enforcement, journalism, music, all these different areas. And the book kind of gets into, why that happens, what it is, and what can you do to stop it. So,
That's dope.
check it out. It's from Triumph Books. Find that anywhere.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, you know, author, critic. How many other hats do you you wear? Professor, So all of these things that you encompass, man, we appreciate you for doing what you do. And
Hey, bro,
that's
appreciate you.
it.
What's up?
It's another episode of Uncommon Knowledge. Dr. Jabari Evans, Evan F. Moore, signing out. Peace. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's Naledge, since 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.